but they always try to find that little hypocritical thing and pick at it, until it's convincing enough for them so that they feel good about what they're doing. Hey guys, it's Rose and welcome back to Cheap Lazy Vegan and another Vegan Talks video. So today's video I'm going to be discussing the ever so popular Netflix docu-series called Tiger King. It basically came out, and I think it came out at just the right time when everyone was staying at home and they needed some entertainment, and boy was this pretty entertaining, I'm not gonna lie, okay? It was quite the dramatic show with so many different, very unlikable but also eccentric characters that make it extremely interesting to watch. I wasn't originally going to do a video on this because Daniel and I actually discussed it in full detail in our podcast. So, we went into the nitty-gritty, we talked about the different aspects and different characters and stuff like that. So I'm going to link the podcast episode down below for those of you guys that want that full in-depth discussion. But in this video, I want to talk about specifically a few things that really bothered me about this show. Now, obviously, I'm not a filmmaker, but I do know a little bit about animal rights and animal rights issues. So I feel like from my perspective, a lot of things were misrepresented, and I think when people watch it from the angle of not knowing much about the animal rights issues, people would come out with false ideas. The messaging was just so muddled. Muddled? Is that the right word? It was just very... There was no message, basically. There was no message. I was also quite inspired to make this video because I watched Unnatural Vegan's video and she was discussing Tiger King and all that stuff. So if you want to check her video out, I'll link that down below as well. Not surprisingly, the main thing that bothered me about this docuseries was the misrepresentation of what it means to be a sanctuary versus a zoo. I feel like they try to really push this narrative that Big Cat Rescue, which is the sanctuary that was mentioned in the docuseries, they try to keep pushing this narrative that Big Cat Rescue was just as bad as any other zoo or any other person that owns and breeds tigers. They didn't go in depth enough to allow the viewer to understand the true differences between Big Cat Rescue and Joe Exotic's zoo. The reason why I want to make this video is because not just because of this series and what's going on within this realm, but because it paints a bad picture, I feel, of sanctuaries in general and gives people a false idea of the differences between a sanctuary and a zoo, because there are so many differences. I did a little bit of digging afterwards, and of course I found out that, of course, things were misrepresented, and I just want to talk about that in this video. I'm not going to discuss in this video the whole Carole Baskin feeding her husband to a tiger, that kind of narrative that we discuss in the podcast. So if you want to hear my thoughts on that, you can listen to the podcast or watch us on YouTube. We also have a YouTube channel. Anyway, apparently according to Carole Baskin and her current husband, the show producers apparently approached them in the beginning because they claimed that they wanted to make a big cat version of Blackfish, essentially. So something that kind of exposes what is going on in the big cat world and how big cats are being exploited and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure how much truth there is to that part, but they definitely did not do their job if that's what their mission was. Obviously, throughout filming this kind of thing, your narrative might change and what you focus on might change, but it could not have gone further from their original plan if that was the case. So it was a bit surprising for me to see that, because for me, from my perspective, when I watched it, I could not really get the whole narrative of trying to actually expose what's going on in the big cat world. It almost glamorized it in different ways. I felt like they kind of had a little bit of a message of the animal rights thing, especially at the very end there, but overall, the messaging was just muddy at best. Muddy. So let's talk about the things that they do to basically downplay Big Cat Rescue and what happens in an animal sanctuary. Now, I will preface this by saying that I don't know that much about Big Cat Rescue, and that, I'm sure it's not perfect. I'm sure there are issues within Big Cat Rescue as a sanctuary, but I do feel like a lot of the things that they did in the documentary were extremely dishonest, So I will give them credit because they did mention that the main difference between Big Cat Rescue and other zoos is that they don't do the breeding. So they don't do the breeding, and they basically allow these animals that have been bred to live out the rest of their lives in peace and in a nice environment without being exploited. So they did mention that in the beginning, but then you go a few more episodes in and then they start basically making it seem like what she's doing is just as bad as Joe Exotic Zoo, which is just completely false. So let me just talk about the no breeding aspect a little bit more because I feel like this could have been touched on a bit more. So this is one of the main differences between this sanctuary and a zoo. So a zoo would breed animals to make a profit. That is the one thing that is the purpose of a zoo. It is for profit, is to make money, and that is why they need to continuously breed animals. Even if it is not natural for a tiger to be living in Alabama, they will still continue to breed those tigers and keep them in cages so that they can make money from those tigers. A sanctuary, on the other hand, would take tigers or other animals that have already been bred. So basically the damage is done. They will take that damage and they will try to make the best out of a bad situation. So this situation is already bad. We've got thousands of tigers living in America, apparently. I didn't even realize there were more tigers living in captivity in America than there are wild tigers, which to me is so sad. So basically they're taking this problem that has already been created by the overbreeding of tigers, and they are allowing these tigers to live the rest of their lives without further breeding in a nice environment. A sanctuary would not have to exist if the breeding did not exist. Okay? It's kind of like having an animal shelter. Animal shelters would not have to exist if the overbreeding of cats and dogs was not a problem. This narrative that they were pushing that, oh, Carole Baskin still keeps her animals encaged, she still keeps her animals in captivity, so she's just as bad as the people that are doing the breeding, is just nonsense. I don't know if people are I don't know if they're miseducated. I don't know if they're trying to overlook this extreme difference between the two, but it seems pretty obvious that what Carole Baskin is doing is very different from what Joe Exotic is doing. Now, you can think whatever you want about Carole Baskin as an individual. Putting aside the individual Carole Baskin and looking at the organization of Big Cat Sanctuary as a whole, it was really unfair for them to be comparing Joe Exotic Zoo to Carole Baskin, what she's doing. Not only is she allowing these tigers to live in peace, but she's also actively fighting to end the breeding of these big cats and the private ownership of these exotic animals that should not exist to begin with. Second thing that they kept trying to push to the audience, I felt, was this idea that Carole Baskin is also making so much money from these big cats, and because she's making money, she's just as evil, she's just as bad as any of these for-profit zoos. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but nothing is free in this world. Nothing is free. Things cost money. Whether it's a sanctuary or a zoo, things will cost money, and money needs to be made in order to maintain something like a sanctuary or a zoo. Yes, she needs to make money. Surprise! She's running a sanctuary of tigers. I imagine they are not very cheap to take care of and to feed, and she clearly has a big piece of land that again needs to be maintained, and also of course she needs to probably raise money for, you know, the advocacy that she's doing. They do need to make money. They both need to make money, but it's what's been done with the money that makes a big difference. Joe Exotic is feeding his animals expired Walmart meat. Anyway. And clearly he's doing this for a profit. A sanctuary is a non-profit organization. There are differences between a for-profit organization and a non-profit organization. They both need to make money. People seem to think that a nonprofit should not be making any money. The purpose of a nonprofit is not that they shouldn't make any money or bring in any money at all. It's that the money that they make goes back into the organization and the cause that it represents. Whereas in a for-profit organization, the money will go into the pockets of the owners, and it's more about the individual gain rather than any sort of cause. They kept trying to equate these two things. They kept trying to be like, oh, she's making all this money. I'm like, but where is she spending the money? I would understand if you were critiquing the way she was spending the money, because maybe she was not actually spending the money on the taking care of the animals, but I don't think that there was, maybe I missed it, I'm not sure, but I don't think there was really any parts that they were really saying, oh, so-and-so is raising all this money, but it's actually actually going into her pocket and it's actually going to her buying all these Ferraris and all that stuff. But they were basically just critiquing the fact that she was making money off of them. Of course she's making money. She's taking care of tigers. They need money to be fed and to have, you know, a safe place to live in. So again, not the same thing. Not the same thing. And one thing that was really, really, really dishonest about the documentary, which I found out after, because on the Big Cat Rescue website, they actually did a full kind of page dedicated to refuting some of the things that were discussed. So if you want to read that, I'll link that down below. Again, you can take that with a grain of salt. I'm not sure how much truth there is, especially when it comes to the individual aspect of talking about Carole Baskin as a person, but I'm focusing more on the organization. So Big Cat Rescue as an organization. And one of the things that was really misrepresented, I believe, the part where they're kind of talking about how Carole Baskin is basically doing the same thing because she's having all these visitors from around the world. First of all, the person who's talking is Joe, who, I mean, I don't think is a very credible source, but they seem to like take what he says and kind of makes it appear as though what he's saying is legitimate. And not just with him, but like basically with anyone that's on the show that's pretty much not credible at all, which is basically like 99% of the people that are featured on this show. So they basically take all these people that clearly don't really give a shit about animals, have a vested interest in bringing down Carole Baskin as a person, and basically just have a very biased viewpoint and no credibility whatsoever. And they make it seem like what they're saying is legitimate by the footage they put in and the kind of way that they've edited it and the way that they've like produced it. They just kind of make it seem like what they're saying is credible. So Joe is saying all this stuff about like, oh, Carole Baskin, she's doing the same thing as I am. She's also bringing in people. Why are you having all these visitors from around the world? And why do you allow them to go and step foot inside your sanctuary and blah, 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 blah. What is the difference between what you're doing and what I'm doing? I'm also making money. You're also making money. There is no difference. And then, of course, they show the footage of Carole Baskin at Big Cat Sanctuary, and there's like this giant lineup of people ready to visit, and Carole Baskin is like taking a video of them and telling them to hashtag Big Cat Rescue and all that stuff. Now, they conveniently forgot to mention that that event that they filmed was a once-in-a-year event, which is also a fundraiser. So very dishonest, I would say. They clearly knew what they were doing when they were doing that, because they probably knew that it was a once-a-year fundraising event. They just conveniently forgot to mention that on the show, which I felt like was one of the most dishonest things that they could have done. So yes, they do have visitors, but apparently they go in small groups, and of course, they do not touch the tigers. They are not allowed to touch the tigers, and they don't have any sort of contact with the tigers whatsoever. They just, you know, walk around the sanctuary. This is how sanctuaries work, guys. This is how sanctuaries work. This is how a lot of sanctuaries raise money. So there's a big difference between a zoo, especially a petting zoo that allows, you know, cup petting and, you know, people to go and like touch the animals and take pictures with the animals, and a sanctuary that actually educates people on what happens to tigers that are being bred and live their lives in captivity. Huge difference, night and day, and they seem to basically ignore that difference. There was also that part in the series where Joe Exotic actually goes to Big Cat Rescue and like films some undercover footage to show his audience that basically what he's doing is just as bad as what Carole was doing. And I was just shocked because, again, none of what he was saying was credible or made any sense, but the series made it seem like what he was saying was like valid almost. One of the things that he mentioned was the fact that, what did he say? He was basically like, oh, she claims to have like over 100 tigers, but we only saw 12. And he made it seem like that was a bad thing, that he only saw like 12 of the tigers, and apparently she has like 100. Like, where are they? Where are all these tigers? And clearly, you are not seeing all these tigers because they live in a giant piece of land, so they actually have a lot of space to run around, and they aren't forced to come over when the humans are over. They aren't forced to entertain the humans, so they're just out doing their own thing. To me, that's very obvious, but I mean, to him, it was like a way of him exposing Carole for like being a liar or something. And to me, it was so obvious why, you know, the tigers, he wasn't seeing all these tigers, because you're not guaranteed to see all of these tigers when you are going into a sanctuary. Okay, they get to do whatever they want, and you are just the visitor. The tigers are not there to entertain you. You are just visiting their home. And I think that people that don't really understand the difference between us using animals for entertainment and us actually taking care of animals wouldn't see the difference. But, in a zoo, tigers, are kept in much smaller enclosures, so of course you're going to see them. And people are there to entertain themselves, so they want to see the animals. Versus a sanctuary, it's much more for education. So I think that when people complain that, oh, I didn't get to see any tigers, they're missing the point of a sanctuary. They're missing the point of why a sanctuary exists. It's not for your entertainment. It's for the purpose of taking care of those animals. So that's one thing that I thought was funny, that he thought he was exposing Carole Baskin for, being a liar and a fraud. But really, you're in a sanctuary. Those tigers are not gonna, those 100 tigers are not just gonna come out for you and entertain you. They are just living their lives and you are just a visitor. So you aren't entitled to see them, okay? And he also showed like a part where there was like a lot of grass that was growing out, and he was like, oh my God, like look at all this, like, look how unkempt this is. But I'm like, isn't that just, naturally how tigers like to live? Like, I don't know. For them to basically make it seem like the sanctuary has these awful conditions when clearly it is just not true at all. And they did not really delve into the side of the sanctuary. They were not trying to defend the sanctuary at all in this show. And it's clear when you actually just take 2 seconds to look at the pictures and the videos, you can just clearly see the differences between the sanctuary and the zoo. It takes 2 seconds. It takes 2 seconds to show that the sanctuary has so much more space, so much more greenery, not small cages like you can see in Joe Exotic's zoo. I just felt like it was so dishonest. I'm not sure if they were doing it on purpose or if they personally did feel that there really were no differences between the sanctuary and a zoo, and that they were all just a bunch of people that were out for greed and out for making a lot of money, and they all just wanted the same thing, which is power and money. And I just feel like it's just so dishonest. Another point that they kept making, which I was like, why is this even relevant? was the fact that she used to breed animals. So I guess when she was with her ex-husband, they were breeding the big cats. It used to be called something else. I think it was called like Wildlife on Easy Street or something. So they used to be kind of more similar to, I guess, a zoo, essentially. After realizing that the breeding of the cats was not really fixing any problems, it was causing more problems than it was fixing, she decided to stop breeding and turn her big cat operation into a sanctuary. So to me, that's a very good thing. But they almost made it seem like because she has this history of breeding cats that she's now a hypocrite. Again, they kept showing Joe talking about this and making him seem like a credible source when clearly he's not only batshit crazy, but has a vested interest in taking her down. So they show this clip of him saying stuff like, oh, let me just remind you, Carole, that you were also breeding animals, you were also breeding tigers, and you also purchased tigers for however much money. And again, I'm just thinking, yeah, she did, but she's not doing it anymore because she's learned better. She's changed her ways. This is a good thing. It just seems so obvious to me. And I was listening to this podcast where Carole Baskin was talking about her, she was talking about her side of the story a little bit. I'll link the podcast down below if I can find it. And she kind of discusses why she stopped breeding the cats, why she stopped breeding big cats, because she used to think that breeding them was a good idea because breeding them would help the endangered species. But then she realized, I can't remember the full story, but she realized afterwards that it wasn't actually helping, it was actually causing more problems. So that's when she kind of had that light bulb moment and she decided to stop breeding the animals. To me, that's a pretty important thing to add into, a discussion when talking about the differences between somebody that used to breed animals and somebody that still does breed animals. Big difference. Big difference. Another thing that I thought was just annoying and misrepresented was the part where they were showing the volunteers in the Big Cat Rescue Sanctuary and how they have these different colored shirts, and they kind of the whole series, I felt like they were just constantly trying to equate what Carole Baskin is doing with the rest of the big cat owners. So first they talked about Carole Baskin and the Big Cat Rescue and how they have all these volunteers that are unpaid, which is a very normal thing in a sanctuary, guys. It is a non-profit sanctuary. Of course there are volunteers. These are volunteers. Do you know the difference between a volunteer and exploitation? There are two differences. For me, because again, I know what a sanctuary is, because I know what it is, I can clearly see the difference. Even when I watch the show, I can clearly see the difference between the happy volunteers that are there to volunteer with these animals. And, you know, they want to work for this organization. It's like a charity. People volunteer in a charity. You know, this is not new information. But then they show that footage of the volunteers and they emphasize that, oh, they don't get paid. Again, they're volunteers. But they also do have paid employees. And then right after they talk about that, they go into like Doc Antle and what he does in his operation and how he basically, you know, brings in all of these attractive females and basically exploits them, pays them like $100 a week, doesn't allow them to go visit their family, basically makes them work 12-hour days, makes them sleep in really horrendous conditions, and basically runs like a sex cult. And putting all of those things into like one episode as if they were all kind of the same thing, and just pushing that kind of narrative forward. When I see other YouTube comments, other YouTube videos, other people talking about this, all of the comments make it seem as though people actually are not understanding the differences. And that's why I feel like it's important to talk about the differences in this video, because people are literally commenting things like, well, Carole Baskin is just as bad because she's also not paying her employees. She's exploiting her employees. These are volunteers. Again, I'm not saying that this Big Cat Rescue is perfect and that they don't have problems and that maybe I don't know what they're doing, okay? But there is a difference between having volunteers that want to help a charity and help the cause of rescuing big cats from exploitative conditions to exploiting people that are at the end of their ropes, basically criminals that have nowhere else to go, that just got out of jail maybe, or drug addicts that just need their next hit, and taking those people that are basically in need of help and bringing them into your zoo to make them work by giving them a place to live. Basically what Joe Exotic was doing was bringing in people that have absolutely nowhere else to go, essentially. They don't really have another job. They don't have any place to live, and picking them up and giving them a place to live, giving them Walmart meat, and basically allowing them to have a job. Clearly that is very exploitative, and you know, that's something to discuss. But to equate that to Carole Baskin having volunteers to work at her nonprofit charity organization that fights to end tiger breeding, again, to me it's night and day. But clearly the messaging was to push this narrative that it's basically the same thing. You can tell that the narrative has been pushed, and a lot of people bought that narrative based on so many of the comments that I've seen and so many videos that I've seen where people are basically saying, yeah, she's just as bad. She's just as bad as Joe Exotic and Don Antle and all these other people that clearly are so much worse. Pushing aside the narrative that she killed her husband, which, I mean, again, you'll have to listen to the podcast to find out my thoughts on that. I just felt like she was an easy person to vilify because she was just a bit quirky and weird, and she had the kind of crazy eyes going. I feel like anytime anyone is an advocate for animals, or anyone tries to fight for animal rights, or any other issue for that matter, the people doing the most harm are the first ones to basically turn around and try to find whatever they can to make it seem like those animal rights activists are hypocrites. You know, even though what they're doing is a million times worse than what the animal rights people are doing, but they always try to find that little hypocritical thing and pick at it, you know, until it's convincing enough for them so that they feel good about what they're doing. So this is what they're doing. You know, we've got Joe Exotic literally keeping animals in tiny cages and constantly breeding these these tigers so that they're cute and, you know, people want to pet them and all that stuff. And who knows what's happening to all these tigers that he's breeding. And clearly he's abusing these tigers. He's creating these big problems. And he's turning around and basically trying to pick apart at anything he can find in order to make his case that, you know, they're all just as bad. And apparently that's just cause for doing the harm. You know, that's what's funny to me. It's like, you know, it's the same people that are trying to basically make vegans look like hypocrites. They're like, oh, but you use cell phones. You use cell phones, so you're a hypocrite. So what I'm doing is not that bad because you're a hypocrite because you use a cell phone that's been made by people in China. I've mentioned this before, but pointing out someone's hypocrisy is not going to make what you're doing any more moral or any more ethical. I could be a huge hypocrite, but when I say that it's wrong to unnecessarily harm another animal or another sentient being for personal pleasure, the statement is correct. It doesn't matter what I do. If a rapist were to say that murder is wrong, they would still be correct. They would be a hypocrite, but they would still be correct in what they said. Murder is still wrong despite who is saying it and how hypocritical the person is that is saying it. Yeah, I just feel like all these people were trying to vilify Big Cat Rescue and picking at any hypocritical thing that they could find, even though it's clear to me that big differences between Big Cat Rescue and all the other zoos, but they were just trying to pick at it. This is what happens when anybody advocates for animals. They're constantly picked apart. So it's kind of like when environmentalists get picked apart by, like, you know, ever using anything with plastic. It's like, oh my God, I thought you were an environmentalist. Why are you using, you know, that plastic thing? It's like, okay, let's look at the bigger picture here. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of what bothered me about the show. Just kind of this weird narrative of trying to equate those two things that don't equate. Yeah, what did you guys think of the show? Did you agree with what I said? Did you agree with what bothered me? Did you not agree? Let me know down below your thoughts. And again, if you guys are interested in the kind of full discussion between me and Daniel about the show in general, you can check out the podcast episode. I'll link that down below. We also have a YouTube channel as well, so if you want to subscribe to that, please subscribe. I'll link the video down below of when we discuss this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you give this video a big thumbs up. And if you're new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!